In the Gansu province, the Miram leader Hugong whistled past the corridor and towards his dining chamber. A freakishly fat old man whose chair almost gave in under the huge weight of his. With his mouth drooling already, he starts to dine, wondering what delicacy to eat first. As he's about to have his first bite, a subordinate named Jae Gal-hai intervenes with an urgent report. Being the alliance leader, he asks her to postpone the matter for 2 hours. But as an acquaintance since childhood, she ignores and excuses herself in. He asks her to eat alongside her, believing being chubby was the key to becoming attractive. The pair share a hearty laugh. She informs him of 2 particular incidents. First, the Green Mountain King had found his calling in life and his cows now produced the best beef. Recalling there's upcoming bad news too, they ceased their excitement for a while. They had received a letter from the Hyeonam branch, saying that the Sword Saint had started to move. And in accordance to their intel, he might reach the province by the noon of the next day, from which Hugong deduces he must have rushed on his path. The Sword Saint was the strongest swordsman known to the world. But 10 years ago, he had cut off all his connections with the Alliance and now had suddenly returned, demanding to fight the Miram Alliance leader. After many concerning but delicious bites, he concludes he needs to run away. To him, running away seemed 100 times better than being killed by the Sword Saint. Jae Gal-hai presses her wish on seeing him fight. Ever since she was a child, she had only seen him eating. She points out how he had previously killed the demon cult's Berserk Blood Saint, Phantom Valley's Phantom Saint, and Tibet's Demon Death King. In an attempt to excuse himself of the situation, he says he had killed them purely by chance. With his huge belly now, even walking a while left him exhausted. Fighting a man like Sword Saint was a definite funeral for him. He plans of running away the same night to either to the Cow King Mountain or to the Een Ferry of the Northern Sea. She says she'd soon follow him wherever he'd go after a half-year passed. With pity-filled eyes, he asks why was she behaving in such a manner. When she is just about to reply, he is alarmed. He hushes her abruptly, and activates his clairvoyance. He finds a few of his subordinates in a dire situation. One of them, relaying a terrible news to the others. The Sword Saint had slaughtered the entire Hyeonam branch. The Wudang and Shaolin sect were trying to buy time by apprehending him, but nothing was certain and the alliance leader was to be alerted of it immediately. At the mention of killings, Hugong is alerted. The Sword Saint he had known was a righteous and respected man. There was a single reason he could think of: energy deviation. A condition where the energy in a person's body goes haywire, leading to violent and demonic tendencies. He expands his clairvoyance further, probing past entire leagues. He finds him, at the Shaolin Temple, attacking the defending Shaolin monks. He concludes his decision and relays it to his niece, Jae Gal-hai, who refuses to believe such a thing. He wonders of what could have happened to the pious man he once knew. Prioritizing the search for Sword Saint, he storms off, breaking past the ceiling. The monks were now demanding the Sword Saint to come back to his senses. They ask why the noblest and respected being in the entire world do such a thing. He admits, saying he indeed was humble and benevolent, but the fat and pathetic Hugong did as he pleased. And despite all that, he was still called the world's strongest. He wonders how joyous he might have felt after driving him, the Sword Saint, out. He justifies how Hugong used to pitifully talk to him. And he, being a weak individual, was forced to be humble and act humble all the time. Frustrated at how his efforts, his talents, abilities, etiquettes, knowledge, physical prowess and knowledge weren't acknowledged by the world. And now, he had returned as the strongest to teach him of humility by defeating him. He was now the strongest man and swordsman, in whose presence everyone would cower in fear and pray to him. How the world would now acknowledge his painful efforts and suffering he underwent to surpass Hugong. The abbot prays to Lord Amitabha, saying his sword saint was no more sane. At this remark, the swordsman gets severely agitated and flings the monk across the room, almost killing him. He speaks of how no one will be surviving the world he would create, how he would destroy everything existing, with the overwhelming powers he now possessed. A sudden light shines, and he is astonished. Both of his arms were suddenly falling down his sides, his sword still in its grip as Hugong materializes in front of him. Knowing one responsible, he laughs bitterly. He speaks of he wasn't able to surpass him regardless of all efforts. But, he also speaks of how Hugong too won't be lasting forever, of how he had seen in the darkness of how he too will break and become someone whom even the slightest wind would sway. Hugong, now irritated, with a flick of his finger, decapitates him. He now pitifully looks at that remains of his old friend. After half a year passes, he one day awakes from his sleep. When he reopens his drowsy eyes, he ponders if it was previously all a dream. He is shocked. He wakes up hurriedly, terrified, that the place he awoke at wasn't his bedchamber but a place he didn't recognize. He tries to think of what they did to him, since he couldn't even walk well. He stumbles across a mirror and is left dumbstruck. The mirror no more reflected the majestic and chubby figure of his. He tries to figure out what might have happened. He could not have transmigrated in time since he didn't look like this when he was younger. It neither was a possession since he didn't feel another soul in this body besides his own. A change of souls, he concludes. But he wonders why was it not only with a body who was on the verge of death, but also the internal and external energy were a total mess. He takes a good look at his body. The body had numerous injuries and bruises all over. Who the hell was the owner of this body, he wonders. He had no enemies with grudges, so tries to think of who probably might have planned it all. He hopes the other soul doesn't do anything stupid with his own body. He hears hurried footsteps in the corridor. An old man with a pouch in his hands walk in, thankful that he's awake. Hugong realizes who he was after a while. He was Biam Cheon, the patriarch of the Heavenly Grand Archive he had met with 5 years ago. The Heavenly Grand Archive was a family of geniuses and one of the 3 great archives on the Central Plains. He asks him to come closer, saying that his wish had now become his own. From the pouch of his, he furnishes a black medicine. Seeing the suicidal injuries on his body and the sad look in the old man's eyes, he understands that the black ball wasn't a medicine but poison. Before things proceed any further, Hugong asks who the current Muram Alliance leader was. Old man Biam now gets totally agitated, saying that after trying to die all this time and disgracing his name, when he finally can, he is asking questions as to who the leader is. He asks the old man to leave since he doesn't wish to die anymore. Old man Biam now jumps on him. He tries using his previous powers but could not. He finally tries to run away, but the weak and frail body so slow he could not escape. Old man Biam now forcefully feeds him the poison ball, despite his protests. He hits the old man on his neck finally, trying to break free. He manages to get him off him and spits out the poisonous ball. But sadly a bit of poison had already been ingested, rendering him unconscious. With his consciousness fading away, he hears the old man talking to him, asking him to finally die after all the years. He pleads his grandfather, pleading him to let him live. His grandfather now comes to his senses and freaks out, calling for the doctor. His eyes shut close. On the other hand, the other soul awakes in the body of the Alliance leader Hugong. He looks around, finally finding a few swords perched on the wall. He calls for someone to confirm no one's around. Then, with an evil laugh, expressing his delight, kills Hugong. The news soon spreads, shocking all of the province. Back at the Grand Archive, with the protagonist asleep, the grandfather and doctor discuss the cure of the poison he'd been fed. The doctor says he would be cured within a month and the remaining poison would be expelled within a month and a half. After a while, the protagonist's two brothers appear. Thinking how he's asleep after causing such a rumor, he probably would live longer than them. He isn't even considered a human, much less a brother. The MC, under the pretense of sleep, was awake the whole while. He is curious after how he, the eldest son of the Grand family, had almost a near-death experience, but only 3 people came for a visit. But, aside of that, he did gain some information. The body he was in belonged to the eldest son of the family, Beam Hang. Someone who was desperately obsessed with dying. He assumed that since none besides the 4 visitors paid a visit, the parents of the child were probably already dead. Such lunacy was probably a result of their deaths. Drunk brothers, and a sad patriarch who almost killed his grandson. He guesses the archive household had fallen. He had 4 major concerns as of now. First, how had his soul entered this body? Secondly, everything going on was just as the Sword Saint had stated previously, but how and why? Third, who was the one after all the incidents? And finally, he was terribly hungry. He wakes up finding a face way too close to his face. She identifies herself as Sianga, a maid in the household. When he asks her for some food, she frantically explains how he'll probably try to die again after gaining back a bit of his strength. He assures her he wouldn't and asks who the current alliance leader was. She denies first, but after a bit of buttering gives in. She explains how the alliance leader was a total powerful but huge pig. Hearing his own disgrace, Hugong, or the now Beam Hang, pales. He says he wants to become like him too, which gets her running towards the kitchen. After 10 days pass, he makes notable recovery, eating food and medicine. His grandfather and doctor having a conversation while he's asleep. They talk of how things have been changing. How the elder young master had been improving slowly, and of how the Murim Alliance leader had committed suicide in his chambers. Hearing this in his pretentious sleep, Beam Hang starts gritting his teeth. He wakes up shouting and threatening that he'll kill the lunatic. How he should have at least discussed things with him before dying. With the strain on his body, he collapses. Hi's grandfather, hearing the words that he wants to kill someone, gets positive hopes that his grandson was finally decisive of something besides murder. With the real Beam Hang now dead, it became impossible for him to return to his body since he killed it too. With his maid Sianga in tow, he starts to train. With his weak and frail body, he starts doing push-ups, horse stances, squats, and even splits. He had also been eating and requesting for meals from time to time. The news of which shocks his grandfather. About a year ago, Beam Hang had suddenly become a joyous lad, very contradictory to his suicidal behavior. After a while, when everyone had let their guards down, he tried to hang himself. Fortunately enough, he was found before he died. However, the smile on his face with bloodshot eyes was too traumatic for all, as if a madman. The subordinate is confirmed that he will yet again try to die, but his grandfather on the other hand doesn't want to put a stop to his recovery just because he is scared. After a while, he calls for Beam Hang. His grandfather asks if he recalled anything since then, but he denies any progress while doing his usual exercises, saying he didn't have even a single second to be wasted. During his workout, he slowly reveals to him that he should not worry about him dying, since Beam Hang, the Heavenly Archive's eldest master, he knew was already dead. His grandfather is shocked. He staggeringly asks if such was the case, "Then who was he?" To which he replies smiling, "He was the strongest man in the entire world." In a bar not quite far off, the two siblings Beam Yoon and Beam Bugong were having a drink. Beam Yoon, recalling the last year's incident, says how it's just another effort he is making to make them let their guards down. His death was the only subject that could bring peace to the house. Bugong protests, saying how if he'd meet him once he'd understand of how sincerely their elder brother is trying to change. At the mention of the term elder brother, Yoon is agitated and threatens him, creating a ruckus. Another man at the same place tries to ask them to quiet down, but violently. Although he was drunk, he was still a child of the heavenly archives. He knocks the man out. Bugong gathers his courage and asks him of how long he intended to keep running away from the reality. The now frustrated Yoon now shoves him to the ground and walks off with motives to prove him wrong. Beam Hang now is training with his maid Seonga amongst the trees. He managed to do 25 push-ups, 20 sit-ups, 20 squats and 8 straight minutes of horse stance. After it, the pair move on to improving his squats with a stick if it wasn't dangerous enough for the frail him already. Hyped up with the progress, Seonga continues rising the difficulty constantly. She forgets the patient and concern wash him and not her. When she is helping him with his handstands, he notices someone nearing them. She asks him to be careful as she lets him down. Seeing this, Yoon sarcastically remarks how he found a man and woman in the woods doing some intimate stuff and cusses. When Seonga informs him, it is his younger brother Yoon, the second eldest master of the heavenly archives. He is startled how his younger brother could cuss at him like an uneducated drunkard. Hearing this remark, his brother sarcastically states how he must have become friends with the Grim Reaper trying to die so many times. He asks him to stop his act of casualty and memory loss. Hearing this, he smiles calmly and asks Seonga to bring him a stick. With assurance that he can now move about freely, he is confident using a stick since he was after all the strongest man. A dog was nowhere a trouble for him. Seonga warns him of how the second master had also learnt martial arts. He asks her to stand back and shouts towards the trees on his left, alerting the 4 hidden bodyguards to stand back and avoid interference. Seonga informs that they were on the right of his. Yoon mocks his poor acting and decides he will dub him as his elder brother. He rushes headfirst. Hang pulls his stick back. Thinking he was scared, Yoon smirks, thinking he would easily dodge it. Hang strikes his left shoulder with his wooden stick, sending him flying and breaking it. Demanding he sobers up and now refers to him as his big brother. He cusses at him yet again with a feint and attacks again, saying he'd rather die than call him his brother. With no other solutions, he beats him up, battering him with his now broken stick. Seonga asks him to stop. Yoon wonders how his corpse-like brother was pounding him and how he became so strong in such a short time. Resolute that he'll revert back to his suicidal behavior, soon revealing his true colors, and thinking of him as a demon, attacks him with an intent to kill him, chi energy enveloped around his hand. Hang smirks. With agile movements avoids the direct hit, dodging him. He repents that he has no other choice. While Yoon wonders in a shock what his particular another way might be. He aims for his crotch. Yoon screams, but there's no following noise but the crack of eggs. He crawls on the ground in pain. Bumong screams. He runs towards his brother. Hang apprehends him, saying he wasn't done quite yet. He thrashes Yoon, pounding him from head to toe. Seonga tries to stop him, but he is determined to eat him to death. Yoon, finally understanding the situation he was in, kneels, finally calling him his big brother. Begging his forgiveness and admitting his mistake. Hang asks how he behaved so insolently despite knowing who he was. Yoon recalls overhearing his grandfather a few days ago saying Hang was acting weirdly and saying he was the strongest man. He says he was the strongest man in the world. Thinking he would be spared. He thought he'd be spared. He couldn't have been even wrong. Hang asks him to get on all his fours and strikes his back ruthlessly. Yoon returns to his chambers, his body hurting profusely. He wonders how many years it had been since he had called him his elder brother. In their childhood, he was the smartest of all, which is why he respected him the most. But when the house fell, he naturally felt more disappointed in him. Thinking he'd get back at some point of time, he finally gave up after many years. Bumong arrives at his chambers, paying utmost respects, thinking he had put up an act of getting beaten by his brother out of consideration to boost his courage. Not only does Yoon realize that Bumong had misinterpreted the entire scenario. The prowess eldest brother Hang possessed was on a completely different dimension. Seeing how he even let his crotch get injured, the youngest brother leaves, with plans to avenge him. The next day, while Seonga praises him for the incident last night, he realizes that although his stamina had increased proportionately, he felt uneasy while swinging his arms with speed. He realizes how his soul wasn't in sync with his new body, which reflected how he was unable to unite his spirit, energy and mind. He could improve the spirit and energy factors by himself, but, to improve his mind, he had no clue as to Byum Hang's memories and desires. Seonga states that the third master would be visiting them soon. Hang is hopeful since he was a polite child with great discernment. Suddenly that same child with great discernment and politeness barges in cursing at him. With resolve to beat him up, he approaches Hang with his nunchucks and swing. To his great dismay, second brother, whom he was to avenge, approaches and slams his head, saying whoever used nunchucks in their province had been killed off by swords. Seonga fears of another Yoon had brought him to their grandfather, who was sitting on a stool, while someone familiar lay in the bed beside him. It was Byum Gang, his uncle and father of Yoon and Bumong. Hang realizes that he could not visit him back then, for his own condition was poor. He suddenly grasps his hand, thankful that such a day came. He was really happy for him. Hang notices how weak his hands were. Hang inquires where the source of his injury was, for he lost his memories. At such a question, his uncle astonishingly starts acting up, avoiding the question. Hang concludes he was afraid of him. To change the topic, he blames Tuan Yoon. His uncle too now speaks of how he had started feeling ill ever since Yoon started being drunk. He requests for leave and the pair head towards their respective bedchambers. After meeting with the uncle, Hugong is now certain. All the evils throughout the Grand Heavenly Archive began with Byum Hang. Not only did his uncle fear looking him in the eyes, but also most of the members of the household had quite the similar reactions. He concludes he had to find of the past to get a grasp of the situation. He hears his brother calling at him for a while now. He asks of how he used to always visit the archives whenever he was troubled or lost in deep thoughts. But ever since the fall of the house, the hardly ever saw him, much less in the archive. The idea of visiting the archive sets a spark in Hang's mind. He knew he could find the answers to his question there. Thanking Yoon, he runs off towards the archive, leaving him in a shock. Back at his uncle's chamber, his grandfather and uncle are seen crying, grateful that the eldest had started to change. Yoon barges in with news of Hang going to the archives to gain clues to the past and his memories. They are sure of him trying to suicide yet again after finding about the past. Hugong reaches the place of Hang's private archive. Being neglected for a while, it's covered all over in dust. Moving past and around, he comes across a crooked and inverted book. It was titled, Winter. The book had comparatively less dust settled on it, indicating of someone having read it quite recently. When he opens the upside-down book, letters of various dates fall down. Although they were of different dates, but the person who sent them was someone named Juyang. Hugong guesses he must have been the one who helped Hang with the change of souls and bodies. When he returns the book to its place in the shelf starts to fall on him. He shields using his hand, but the whole thing passes right through him. He guesses that placing the book in its rightful place apparently triggered a trap. The trap was illusionary. Hugong finds himself amidst snow-covered lands and leafless tress. It was too realistically cold to be true. He sights a younger Hang. His mother asks if he was cold, exclaiming at how red his hands were already due to frostbite. His mother asks if he might want to return already. Young Hang childishly refutes, saying it's nothing much for a man to take. His mother laughs kindly, saying even men feel cold and she knows him the best and of how delicate he was. She gives him her own mittens, asking him to quickly build the snowman he was longing for instead of caring for her hands. After he is done, she asks why he built 3 snowmen while he planned for a single one. "It's our family," he says. His mother runs off, calling his father to show him little Hang's creation, giggling. Hugong watches the whole scenario, coming closer now, thinking it must be a happy memory of Biem Hang. The scenario and time lapse. Hugong now in a different time. He comes across a room where Hang's mother was asking his father if he saw the bloomed flowers. While he assures her that he did, she starts coughing. She speaks of how nice it was to be able to see plum blossoms with her family, anticipating the arrival of spring soon. Certainly sick, she calls young Hang over, asking why he was crying, and says how dearly she loved him. Hugong, too, tears up at the warm scene. End of part 1. Do consider dropping a like on this video and subscribing to the channel. Most importantly, comment down below if you wish for the part 2. Thank you.